The Alpha King expected to watch a death recording. Instead, he watched his own beast lower its massive head into a stranger's lap and wag its tail. And the moment that tail hit the ground, Elias felt it in his chest like something snapped loose inside him. His fingers tightened around the console, breath uneven, because whatever that Omega was doing down there, his beast wasn't the only one reacting. 48 hours earlier, Cale Vance sat across a cold steel desk, staring at a contract that could decide the fate of everything he had built. Cale was an Omega, but not the kind most people understood. He was what specialists called a resonant Omega, someone whose pheromones didn't submit to alpha pressure. Instead, they adapted, stabilized, and in some cases, overrode. No alpha had ever forced him to kneel. Not once. That rare trait made him one of the best in the field when it came to handling unstable alphas and aggressive predators. It also made him expensive. But right now, reputation didn't matter. His sanctuary was running out of time. For 6 years, Cale had been running a remote rescue facility that took in animals no one else would touch. Feral wolves, hybrid predators, creatures already marked for euthanasia. He kept them alive. He rehabilitated them. But sympathy didn't pay for land or security, and debt was catching up fast. If he failed to secure funding this month, everything would collapse. Across from him sat Dr. Alistair Kane, a corporate fixer who specialized in cleaning up problems for powerful alphas. 40s, perfectly composed, the kind of man who spoke calmly about dangerous things. He slid the contract forward without hesitation. "Your client is Alaric Rutherford," he said. Cale didn't react, but the name carried weight. Alaric Rutherford, the Alpha King who controlled the Northern Territory. Reclusive, apex alpha whose pheromones alone could force submission from trained alphas. Entire territories shifted around his presence. He rarely appeared in public, and when he did, people remembered one thing: the pressure, like standing too close to something that didn't see you as equal. Cale flipped through the contract. "You said this is about an animal. What exactly am I dealing with?" Kane adjusted his glasses slightly. "A wolf, or something close to it. Unregistered genetics, extreme aggression, carries alpha-level pheromones comparable to Mr. Rutherford himself." He paused, watching Cale carefully. "It has already injured multiple alpha security personnel. Riot gear, sedatives, none of it worked." Cale's fingers stopped on the page. "So you want it controlled?" "We want it stabilized," Kane corrected smoothly. "If that fails, it will be eliminated." His tone didn't change. No hesitation, no concern. It was just another problem to erase. Cale closed the contract slowly. "Why me?" "Because you specialize in cases others consider lost," Smith said. "And because you are the only Omega on record who can stand in front of a dominant alpha without collapsing." That was true, but not the whole truth. Cale picked up the pen. "I don't tame things," he said quietly. "I understand them." Then he signed. 2 days later, Cale drove up a winding mountain road that cut through dense forest and heavy fog. The higher he went, the quieter it became. No signals, no traffic, just distance from the rest of the world. When the estate finally came into view, it didn't look like a home. It looked like a controlled territory carved into the mountain itself. Dark stone, reinforced glass, layered security built to keep things out, or in. At the main gate, he was stopped immediately. Garrett, head of security, all heavily built with old scars that told their own story. An alpha who had clearly survived more than one bad situation. His gaze lingered on Cale for a second longer than necessary, like he was trying to figure out why an Omega was being allowed inside. He scanned him, confiscated his phone, then stepped aside. "Follow me." Inside, the air felt wrong, not cold, pressured. Cale felt it before he saw him. Alaric Rutherford stood near a wide window overlooking the mountains, completely still. Tall, broad-shouldered, dressed simply, but everything about him carried weight. When he turned, the shift in the room was immediate. Pheromones. Heavy, dominant, absolute. An ordinary Omega would have dropped without thinking. Kale didn't move. He stood there, breathing evenly, as his own pheromones adjusted on instinct, smoothing the pressure just enough to remain stable. Not resisting, not submitting, just synchronizing. Alaric noticed immediately. His amber eyes narrowed slightly. Interesting. You're the Omega. I'm the one you hired, Kale replied calmly. A brief silence followed. That answer alone told Alaric more than any file ever could. No submission instinct, no fear response, not even forced politeness, just balance. He took a slow step closer. The pressure in the room should have intensified. Instead, something subtle shifted. For a split second, his pheromones didn't push, they aligned. Alaric's expression hardened immediately, like he rejected the reaction the moment it happened. You understand, he said, that what's below this estate is not something you can approach like a normal case. I don't approach anything normally, Kale said. I observe first. Alaric studied him for a moment longer, then turned away. If it decides to kill you, my men won't reach you in time. I didn't come here expecting protection. Another pause. Then Alaric spoke without turning back. Garrett will take you down. The lower levels felt like a sealed facility. Reinforced corridors, controlled lighting, air carrying a faint metallic scent mixed with something sharper. Pheromones, concentrated and unstable. Garrett stopped in front of a heavy blast door, his posture tightening slightly. He doesn't sleep, Garrett said. Doesn't eat right. Keeps pacing. Broke reinforced glass last week. A short pause. I've seen alphas lose control before. This is worse. Kale nodded once, and Garrett hesitated for just a second. He doesn't come down here. That answered more than anything else. The door opened. Inside was an observation room separated by reinforced glass. Beyond it, an enclosed environment designed to look natural, but still a cage. Dirt, rocks, water, and in the center, the wolf. Kale stopped. It was massive, larger than any predator he had worked with. Fur that swallowed the light, muscles built for impact. But what mattered wasn't the size, it was the scent. Pure alpha, ancient and familiar. Kale's eyes narrowed slightly, because beneath the aggression, beneath the instability, the pheromone signature was identical to the one standing upstairs. The moment he stepped closer to the glass, the wolf stopped pacing. Slowly, it turned, locked onto him. A low, vibrating growl rolled through the enclosure, strong enough to hum through the reinforced walls. Garrett's hand moved toward the emergency control panel. If you go in there, he said, we shoot if necessary. Kale didn't look away. No. Garrett frowned. That's not your call. It is if you want results, Kale said calmly. Turn off the turrets. Silence. Then a green light blinked. Authorization granted. Alaric was watching. Kale exhaled slowly, letting his body settle. His pheromones shifted, low, steady, neutral. Not inviting, not defensive, just present. The inner gate unlocked with a heavy sound. He stepped inside. The wolf didn't charge. It lowered its head slightly and began to move toward him, slow and controlled. Each step carried weight, intent. Kale felt his instincts react, but he didn't step back. Instead, he did the one thing no one in that facility expected. He sat down. Open posture. No defense. No challenge. The wolf stopped just a few feet away, close enough that Kale could feel the heat from its body, close enough that one wrong move would end everything. Kale slowly raised one hand, palm open. Low. An offer. Up in the control room, Alaric's grip tightened. Because as the wolf leaned in, he felt it, the contact like phantom fingers brushing against his own skin. And for the first time in years, his beast didn't want to fight. It wanted to stay. The wolf didn't attack. That alone was enough to make every alpha in the control room hold their breath. But what happened next? That was something no one there had ever seen before. Kale kept his hand steady, palm open, low enough to avoid triggering dominance. His breathing was slow, controlled, his pheromones shifting into a calm, stable frequency. Not seductive, not submissive, just safe. The massive wolf stepped closer. Its amber eyes locked onto him, its muscles coiled with restrained power. 5 steps away. 3. 1. Then it stopped, lowering its head slightly, nostrils flaring as it inhaled Kale's scent. Up in the control room, Alaric felt it again. That exact moment, the inhale. It hit him like a physical sensation in his own lungs. His chest tightened, as if he were the one standing inches away from the Omega. His beast wasn't just observing, it was experiencing. Down in the enclosure, Kale didn't move. He let the wolf take its time. That was the first rule. Never rush a predator that had learned to expect violence. The wolf's growl faded, replaced by a low, uneven rumble that didn't sound like a threat anymore. It sounded conflicted. Kale shifted his hand slightly, just enough to let his fingers brush against the thick fur near the wolf's chest. The reaction was immediate. The wolf froze, and so did Alaric, because the moment Kale made contact, Alaric felt it like electricity running straight through his nerves. Not pain, not fear, something warmer, something dangerously close to relief. His fingers dug into the metal console as his breathing faltered. This wasn't supposed to happen. There was never supposed to be a connection this strong. In the enclosure, the wolf let out a low sound. Not a growl this time, but something softer, almost uncertain. It leaned forward, just slightly, pressing more of its weight into Kale's hand. Kale exhaled quietly. That was permission. Slowly, carefully, he moved his hand upward, fingers sliding into the thick fur behind the wolf's ear. He applied steady pressure, firm but controlled. The wolf's entire body tensed for a second, then dropped. A heavy exhale left its lungs as its hind legs buckled, its massive body lowering onto the ground. Its head tilted slightly, pressing harder into Kale's touch. The sound it made this time was unmistakable, a soft whine. Garrett, standing behind the glass, stared in disbelief. "That's not possible," he muttered under his breath. This was the same creature that had nearly torn through reinforced armor, the same beast that had sent trained alphas to the hospital, and now it was leaning into an Omega's hand like it had been waiting for this. Kale didn't react outwardly, but inside he understood exactly what was happening. This wasn't dominance. This wasn't submission. This was deprivation. The wolf had been isolated, cut off from any form of pack contact, any form of physical reassurance. For something carrying alpha-level pheromones, that kind of isolation didn't just create aggression, it broke stability. "You're not violent," Kale said quietly, his voice low and even. "You're just exhausted." The wolf let out another low sound, pressing its head down further until it rested fully against Kale's lap. Its body relaxed inch by inch, tension bleeding out of its limbs. Kale adjusted his posture slightly to support the weight, his hand continuing to move through the thick fur in slow, steady strokes. Upstairs, Alaric's world tilted, because he felt all of it, the pressure of fingers, the warmth, the calm. For years, his existence had been defined by control, suppressing instinct, locking away the part of him that wanted to dominate, to tear, to claim. He had cut that part out of himself, turned it into something separate, something contained. But now that part wasn't raging. It wasn't trying to break free. It was content. Alaric's breathing became uneven, his control slipping for just a second. He turned away from the screen, running a hand through his hair, trying to ground himself. This wasn't supposed to be happening. No one was supposed to get this close. No one was supposed to affect him like this. Back in the enclosure, Kale shifted slightly, testing boundaries. He moved his hand along the wolf's neck, then down toward its shoulder. No resistance, no aggression, just quiet acceptance. That confirmed it. The wolf wasn't unstable because it was uncontrollable. It was unstable because it had never been given a point of balance. Turn off the external monitoring audio, Cale said calmly without looking back. Garrett frowned. Why? Because if it hears constant surveillance, it won't fully relax, Cale replied. Right now, it's choosing not to see me as a threat. Don't ruin that. Garrett hesitated, then glanced at the camera. A second later, the audio feed cut. Alaric watched in silence, now unable to hear what Cale was saying, but still feeling every second of contact like it was happening to him directly. His chest rose and fell slower now, sinking unconsciously with the rhythm below. That was when he realized something far more dangerous. It wasn't just the beast responding. He was too. Minutes passed, then longer. The wolf didn't move away. If anything, it shifted closer, its massive body pressing into Cale's legs like it didn't want the contact to end. Cale didn't push it away. He adjusted, grounding himself, letting the weight settle. This isn't about control, Cale murmured softly. You don't need to fight everything. The wolf's tail moved once, then again. Garrett stared, frozen, because that wasn't a reflex. That was intentional. The alpha-level predator, the one that had never shown submission to anyone, was responding to an omega not with fear, not with resistance, but with something far more dangerous, trust. Upstairs, Alaric closed his eyes briefly, his jaw tightening. The sensation hit him again, stronger this time. The slow, steady strokes, the calm that followed it. It was addictive. That was the only word for it. His beast wasn't just accepting Cale, it was attaching. Alaric opened his eyes again, gaze locking onto the screen. His voice came out lower than before, almost rough. Pull him out. Garrett stiffened. Sir, he's stabilizing it. Pull him out. Alaric repeated, sharper this time. But Cale didn't move. He hadn't heard the order, and even if he had, he wouldn't have listened, because in that moment, he felt it too. Not just the wolf's breathing, not just its heartbeat slowing beneath his hand, something else. A second presence, distant but connected. Cale's eyes narrowed slightly. Then slowly, he spoke under his breath, barely louder than the wolf's breathing. You're not alone in there, are you? The wolf's ear twitched, and upstairs, Alaric froze. Because for the first time, the Omega wasn't just reaching his beast, he was reaching him. Cale didn't pull his hand away. That was the difference between him and everyone else who had ever stepped into that enclosure. Most people reacted the moment something felt wrong. They broke contact, shifted position, tried to regain control. Cale did none of that. He stayed exactly where he was, fingers still buried in the thick fur, his breathing slow and even, his pheromones steady. But his mind had already locked on to what he just felt. There was something else connected to this wolf, not just instinct, not just behavior, something conscious. The wolf's body remained pressed against him, heavy and grounded, but its ear twitched again when Cale spoke. That tiny reaction confirmed it. It wasn't just responding like an animal, it was listening. Up in the control room, Alaric didn't move. For the first time since this started, his expression lost that cold control. Fingers hovered over the console, but he didn't press anything, because if he stopped this now, he might lose whatever connection had just formed. And that thought unsettled him more than anything. Down below, Cale slowly shifted his position, adjusting one leg so he could sit more comfortably under the wolf's weight. He didn't rush. Every movement was deliberate, controlled. He let his hand move again, sliding from behind the wolf's ear down along its neck, then to its shoulder. No resistance, no tension. The wolf allowed it, even leaned slightly into the touch. That's it, Cale murmured quietly. You don't need to prove anything. The wolf exhaled heavily, its breathing now slow and deep. Its body had completely changed. The rigid, coiled tension from before was gone. In its place was something calmer, something stable. Cale had seen this before in traumatized animals, but never at this scale, never with this level of pheromone intensity. He focused again. There, It was that second presence, faint but unmistakable. It wasn't coming from the wolf's body. It felt layered, like something overlapping it. Cale's eyes shifted slightly, but he didn't look up at the cameras. He kept his attention on the wolf, speaking softly, as if the words were meant for both of them. "You're connected," he said under his breath. Not just physically. The wolf's breathing hitched, and upstairs, Alaric's grip tightened on the console. He felt that too. The reaction, the awareness. His pulse spiked, something sharp cutting through the calm that had settled in his chest. This Omega was figuring it out faster than anyone ever had. Cale didn't stop. "You've been separated for too long," he continued, voice still calm, steady. "That's why it hurts." The wolf let out a low sound, deeper this time, almost like a suppressed growl, but it didn't move away. Stayed right there, head still resting against Cale's lap. That was the key. It didn't reject him, which meant he was right. Cale slowly lifted his other hand, bringing it closer to the wolf's face. He paused halfway, giving it time to react. The wolf's eyes flicked toward the movement, watching closely, but it didn't snap, didn't retreat. Cale gently placed his hand along the side of its jaw, fingers resting lightly against the fur. Contact. And again, Alaric felt it, stronger this time. Not just the physical sensation, but the intent behind it. The calm, the acceptance. It spread through him in a way he couldn't control, pushing past every barrier he had built over the years. His breathing slowed against his will. His shoulders dropped slightly, tension leaving his body without permission. That was when it hit him. This wasn't just the beast calming down. Cale was stabilizing both of them. Alaric stepped back from the console, running a hand down his face, trying to regain control. This was dangerous. He knew it. If this continued, the line between him and the beast would start to blur again. And that was exactly what he had tried to prevent. But he didn't stop it. Because for the first time in years, he didn't want to. Back in the enclosure, Cale adjusted his grip slightly, applying a bit more pressure along the wolf's jawline, testing its tolerance. The wolf responded immediately, tilting its head into his hand, pressing harder. That confirmed something important. "This isn't aggression," Cale said quietly. "It's deprivation." The wolf's tail moved again, slower this time, brushing lightly against the ground. It wasn't frantic, wasn't reactive. It was controlled, intentional. Garrett, still watching through the glass, lowered his hand from the emergency control panel without even realizing it. His posture had shifted too. Tension in his shoulders eased slightly, his gaze no longer locked in anticipation of an attack. Instead, he was watching something else entirely, something he didn't understand. Minutes passed, but Cale didn't rush. He let the wolf settle deeper into the contact, let its breathing stabilize fully. Then slowly, he leaned forward just a fraction, bringing himself closer to its head. "You've been alone for too long," he said softly. "No pack, no contact, no anchor." The wolf's body tensed for just a second, then relaxed again. That hesitation told Cale everything. There was recognition there, not instinct, but memory. Upstairs, Alaric's chest tightened sharply. The word hit him harder than anything else Cale had said. Alone. That was the exact reason he had done all of this. To isolate the part of himself that couldn't function in a structured hierarchy, to contain it, to control it. But now that isolation was the problem. Cale's hand moved again, slower this time, more deliberate. He shifted his fingers into the thicker fur at the base of the wolf's neck, applying steady pressure in a circular motion. The wolf let out a deep, low sound, almost a rumble, and its entire body sank further into the ground, completely relaxed. "That's it," Cale murmured. "You don't need to fight me." The wolf's eyes closed. Not fully, but enough. Trust. Cale's gaze softened slightly, but his focus remained sharp. He had confirmed the behavioral pattern. He had established physical contact. Now came the next step, connection. You can feel him, can't you? Cale said quietly, almost like he was thinking out loud. The wolf's ear twitched again. Upstairs, Alaric stopped breathing for a second. But he can feel you too, Cale continued. The wolf shifted slightly, pressing its head more firmly against Cale's lap, as if reacting to something deeper than just the words. Cale's voice dropped lower. You're not separate. Silence. Then the wolf let out a slow breath, and for a split second, Cale felt it again. That second presence, clearer this time, not just overlapping, reaching back. Cale's eyes narrowed slightly, his hand still moving slowly through the fur. There, it was a response. He didn't smile, didn't react outwardly, but internally everything aligned. This wasn't just a rehabilitation case. This was something else entirely, something that had never been documented. And as the massive wolf lay there, calm, grounded, its body fully relaxed under his touch, Cale understood one thing with absolute certainty. He hadn't just stepped into a cage with a dangerous alpha beast. He had stepped into the center of something broken. And for the first time, it was starting to respond. From that day forward, the pattern changed. Cale stopped being a visitor in the enclosure. He became part of it. Every morning before the security team even rotated shifts, the massive wolf was already waiting near the inner gate. Not pacing, not slamming its body against reinforced walls like before. It waited, still alert. The moment the lock disengaged, it would step forward, not aggressively, but with a kind of focused anticipation that no one there had ever seen from it before. Garrett, who monitored the lower-level security, noticed it first. He had been the one nearly killed during the early containment phase, and he knew exactly how unpredictable the beast had been. Now he stood behind the glass, arms crossed, watching something that made no sense to him. It's tracking his schedule, he muttered once, more to himself than anyone else. Like it knows when he's coming. Cale didn't treat it like a miracle. He treated it like progress. Each session followed a structure. He would enter slowly, no sudden movements, pheromones steady and controlled. He would sit, never stand over it, never challenge its height or space. The wolf would approach every time, lowering its head just slightly before making contact. That detail mattered. It wasn't submission, it was acknowledgement. Cale reinforced it the same way each time. Consistent touch, steady pressure, calm breathing. No rewards, no commands, just presence. And every single time, Alaric felt it first. He tried to ignore it. He stayed in his office, avoided the monitors, buried himself in reports and meetings he hadn't attended in months. But it didn't matter. The moment Cale stepped into the enclosure, the connection activated. The first brush of fingers through fur, the slow press of a hand against the wolf's neck, the shift in breathing. Alaric experienced all of it, as if it were happening to his own body. It wasn't just sensation, it carried emotion. Calm, trust, warmth, things he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. It was becoming a problem. 3 days in, he stopped pretending he could ignore it. By the end of the first week, he was watching every session. By the second week, he couldn't look away. Down in the enclosure, the wolf had changed completely when Cale was present. It no longer paced. It didn't growl. It didn't show its teeth unless startled by external noise. Instead, it stayed close, too close sometimes. More than once, it had shifted its full weight onto Cale's legs, pinning him to the ground like a massive, living restraint. The first time it happened, the security team had almost triggered the emergency override, but Cale had raised one hand slightly, signaling them to stand down. He didn't panic. He adjusted, shifted his position, kept one hand moving along the wolf's neck, maintaining contact. It's not trying to trap me, Cale had said calmly afterward, when Garrett questioned it. It's trying to stay anchored. Garrett didn't like that explanation, but he couldn't argue with the results. Another change came quickly after that. The wolf started bringing things, small things at first. a loose stone, a broken branch. It would carry them in its mouth and drop them near Kale, then sit back, watching him. The first time, Kale didn't react, he observed. The second time, he acknowledged it. A slight nod, a brief touch to the object before returning his focus to the wolf. That was enough. The behavior repeated, more consistently each time. It's offering, Kale explained later during a debrief. He stood across from Alaric in the main study, holding a tablet with recorded data, but his focus wasn't on the screen. Pack resource sharing. It's trying to establish connection in a way it understands. Alaric leaned back slightly, arms crossed, expression unreadable. It has no pack. It does now, Kale said simply. That answer lingered longer than anything else. Alaric didn't respond immediately. Instead, he watched Kale's hands. Clean, steady, the same hands that ran through his beast's fur every day. The same hands he felt every single time. His jaw tightened slightly. You touch it constantly, Alaric said after a moment, his voice lower than before. Kale didn't look away. Physical contact is necessary. Without it, the stabilization won't hold. Alaric's gaze sharpened. And you're certain it's only affecting the animal? There it was, the question beneath the question. Kale paused for half a second, not long enough to be obvious, but long enough to matter. Then he answered honestly. No. Silence filled the room. Alaric's fingers tightened slightly against his arm. Explain. Kale shifted his weight, setting the tablet down on the desk without breaking eye contact. The connection isn't one-directional. It's layered. The responses I'm seeing, both behavioral and pheromonal, suggest that what's in that enclosure isn't isolated. Alaric didn't move. Kale continued, voice steady. It reacts to me, but something else reacts with it at the same time. Same rhythm, same shift. That doesn't happen with a normal subject. Another pause, then Kale said, You're linked to it. The words hung in the air, direct and unavoidable. Alaric's expression didn't change, but the pressure in the room did. It dropped, then surged again, subtle but noticeable. For a second, the control slipped. Then it snapped back into place. You're making assumptions, Alaric said coldly. I'm observing patterns, Kale replied. A long silence followed. Neither of them looked away. Then, unexpectedly, Alaric stepped forward, not aggressively, not dominant, closer. Close enough that Kale could feel the shift in temperature, the faint trace of Alaric's pheromones moving differently this time. Not pushing, not suppressing, searching. Kale didn't step back. For the first time, the distance between them closed without resistance. Alaric's voice dropped, quieter now. Then tell me, Omega, if what you're saying is true. His gaze flicked briefly to Kale's lips, then back to his eyes. Why does it calm down the moment you touch it? Kale held his gaze, unshaken. Because it trusts me. Alaric's jaw tightened slightly. And why would it do that? Kale didn't hesitate. Because I don't see it as something that needs to be controlled. The words landed harder than expected. Alaric stepped back abruptly, turning away, breaking the moment before it could go any further. His hand came up to his neck briefly, as if grounding himself. Tomorrow, he said, voice returning to its usual controlled tone, you'll extend the session time. Kale nodded once. Understood. As he turned to leave, he paused for just a second, glancing back. Whatever you did to separate it, Kale said quietly. It didn't solve the problem. Alaric didn't turn around. I know. Kale left. And for the first time since this started, Alaric didn't feel in control of the situation anymore. Because the bond forming in that underground enclosure wasn't just stabilizing his beast. It was pulling him back towards something he had tried to bury. And the closer Kale got, the harder it became to resist. By the start of the third week, the change was undeniable. The wolf no longer behaved like a contained threat. It behaved like something that had finally found its anchor. It waited for Kale, followed him inside the enclosure, responded to his movement before he even spoke. And most importantly, it calmed the moment he made contact. For the security team, that was progress. For Kale, it was confirmation. But for Alaric, it was something far more dangerous. Because the more stable the beast became, the less stable he felt. Every session hit harder than the last. The connection was no longer faint or distant. It was immediate. The moment Kale stepped into the enclosure, Alaric felt the shift. When Kale's hand moved, Alaric felt it. When the wolf leaned in, Alaric felt the weight of that contact in his own body. And when Kale spoke in that low, steady voice, Alaric couldn't hear the words, but he felt the effect of them. Calm, warmth, acceptance. It cut through him in ways nothing else ever had. He stopped sleeping, not because he couldn't, but because every time he closed his eyes, the sensation lingered. Phantom touches, the echo of Kale's presence, followed him even outside the sessions. And it was getting stronger. Down in the enclosure, Kale had stopped treating this like a standard case entirely. He no longer tracked just behavior. He tracked response timing, synchronization, overlap. The pattern was consistent now. Every reaction from the wolf had a mirrored delay, barely measurable, but there, like a second system processing the same input. He tested it one morning. Instead of immediately reaching out, Kale paused just inside the enclosure. He didn't move closer, didn't initiate contact. He simply stood there, watching. The wolf approached halfway, then stopped, head tilted slightly, waiting. Kale stayed still. 3 seconds. 5. 10. The wolf shifted its weight, then let out a low sound, not aggressive, not warning, and stepped closer, slower this time, until it was within reach. Still, Kale didn't move. Another second passed. Then the wolf lowered its head and nudged forward, pressing lightly against Kale's hand without him offering it. Initiation. Kale's eyes sharpened slightly. Good, he said quietly. Your choice. He finally moved his hand, placing it gently against the wolf's neck, reinforcing the behavior. That confirmed it. This wasn't dependency. This was active bonding. Upstairs, Alaric felt it the moment contact was made. But what caught him off guard was what happened before that. The waiting, the pause, the slight tension that built when Kale didn't move. He had felt that too. The expectation, the need. Alaric's hand tightened against the edge of his desk. That wasn't just the beast reacting. That was him. Later that evening, Kale stood in Alaric's study again for their daily debrief. The dynamic had shifted between them, even if neither openly acknowledged it. There was less distance now, not physically, but something else had changed, awareness. It initiated contact today, Kale said, placing the tablet down. Not reactive, intentional. Alaric didn't respond immediately. He stood near the window, looking out over the dark mountains, but his attention was clearly elsewhere. That means the bond is stabilizing, Kale continued. It's not just accepting me anymore. It's seeking me out. Alaric's jaw tightened slightly. And what does that mean for containment? It means containment is no longer the priority, Kale replied. Integration is. The word shifted something in the room. Alaric turned. Explain. Kale met his gaze directly. You separated it to control it. But the separation is what destabilized it. It doesn't need to be controlled. It needs to be whole. Silence. Alaric's eyes darkened slightly, something sharper flickering beneath the surface. You're suggesting I reverse the process. I'm suggesting you stop treating it like something separate from you. That hit harder than anything else Kale had said so far. Alaric took a slow step forward, the pressure in the room shifting again, subtle but present. His pheromones weren't pushing like before. They were unsettled, fluctuating. You don't understand what that means, he said quietly. Then explain it. Kale replied without hesitation. Another pause. Then, for the first time, Alaric didn't deflect. It's not just instinct, he said, voice lower now. It's everything I cut out. Aggression, dominance, the part of me that doesn't stop. If I let that merge again, he stopped. Cale didn't interrupt. Alaric exhaled slowly, his hand tightening briefly at his side. It won't just stabilize. It will amplify. Cale held his gaze. Then why is it calm with me? That question landed differently. Alaric didn't answer right away, because he knew the answer, but saying it out loud would make it real. Cale stepped closer, not aggressively, not cautiously, just enough. Because it trusts me, Cale said. And you feel that too. Alaric's eyes flickered just for a second. That was enough. Cale didn't look away. This isn't just about it anymore. The bond isn't one-directional. You already know that. Alaric's breathing slowed, but his posture remained tense. And what exactly are you implying? Cale answered without hesitation, that it's not just your beast reacting to me. Silence. Then, it's you. The words hung between them, clear, direct, unavoidable. Alaric's control slipped for a fraction of a second. His pheromones shifted sharply, not outward, but inward, like something tightening, coiling. Then it settled again. But the damage was already done. Cale had seen it. More importantly, he had felt it, because standing this close now, the connection wasn't just in the enclosure anymore. It was here between them. Faint, but present. Cale didn't step back. Instead, he did something no one had done since arriving at this estate. He reached out, slowly, deliberately. His hand stopped just short of Alaric's arm. A clear choice. No sudden movement, no pressure, just an offer. Alaric's entire body went still. For a second, nothing happened. Then he didn't move away. That was all the permission Cale needed. His fingers made contact. Light, barely there, but enough. And the moment it happened, Alaric felt it. Not through the beast, directly. Warmth spread instantly, sharper, clearer than anything he had felt through the connection before. It wasn't filtered, wasn't distant, it was real. Alaric's breath hitched slightly, his control slipping again before he could stop it. His hand twitched, like he was about to pull away, but he didn't. Cale kept his touch steady. No pressure, no demand, just presence. You're not as separate as you think, Cale said quietly. Alaric's eyes lowered briefly, staring at the point of contact. For the first time, he didn't feel like he was losing control. He felt like something was finally aligning. And that realization was far more dangerous than anything else so far. Because if Cale was right, then this wasn't just about stabilizing a beast. It was about undoing everything Alaric had built to keep himself contained. And for the first time, he wasn't sure he wanted to stop it. Everything broke 2 nights later. It didn't start in the enclosure. It started upstairs, in the part of Alaric's world that Cale hadn't needed to touch until now. Dr. Alistair Kane returned without warning, and this time, he didn't come alone. With him were 3 men in tactical gear, part of a private disposal unit contracted by the board. They weren't ordinary security. They were specialists trained to eliminate unstable alpha-class threats, silver nitrate rounds, reinforced armor, synchronized movement. They moved like people who had done this before. Cale was still in the enclosure when the override triggered. The first sign was the sound. Not a roar, not an alarm. A mechanical shift in air pressure as the system locked down. Cale looked up immediately, his hands still resting on the wolf's neck. The wolf reacted too, but not with panic. Its body tensed, ears pulling back, senses sharpening. It felt the change. Upstairs, Alaric stood in the middle of the main hall, facing Kane. The older man didn't bother hiding the intent this time. The board has reached a decision, Kane said calmly. Your condition has become a liability. The asset below is no longer an experiment. It's a threat. We are ending it. Alaric's eyes didn't leave him. You're not authorized. I am acting on behalf of those who control your territory's funding, your infrastructure, your political protection, Kane replied. You may be an alpha king, Alaric, but even kings answer to systems. That was a mistake. The temperature in the room dropped. Not physically, but in pressure. Alaric's pheromones shifted instantly, not spreading, but compressing into something sharp and lethal. Get out. Kane didn't move. The team is already moving. That was when Alaric felt it. Not the words, but the shift below. The moment the internal lock engaged, the connection spiked, sharp, violent. Not calm anymore, not stable. The beast reacted instantly, and Alaric felt that too. Adrenaline, aggression, protective instinct surging all at once. He turned without another word. Back in the enclosure, the inner gate opened. 3 men stepped in, rifles raised, movements precise. Their leader, a tall alpha with a scar running across his jaw, Callum, head of the disposal unit, scanned the enclosure, locking onto the wolf first, then Kale. Step away from the target, Callum said, voice controlled, professional. Kale didn't move. The wolf stepped forward instead, not toward Kale, but toward them. Everything changed in that second. The calm disappeared completely. The grounded, stable presence Kale had built over weeks collapsed under the threat. The wolf's body lowered, muscles tightening, lips pulling back to reveal teeth that had never fully been shown during Kale's sessions. A low growl rolled through the enclosure, deeper than before, heavier. Last warning, Callum said, adjusting his grip on the rifle. Move. No, Kale said calmly, even now. If you fire, you'll trigger a full attack response. Callum didn't hesitate. That's the point. The safety clicked off. Upstairs, Alaric moved. He didn't call security, didn't give orders, didn't think. He ran, down the corridor, through reinforced doors, past Garrett, who had already drawn his weapon but didn't try to stop him. Garrett knew. There was no stopping this anymore. Back in the enclosure, the first shot fired. It wasn't lethal, not yet, but it hit. The silver nitrate round grazed the wolf's shoulder, and the reaction was immediate. Pain, sharp, burning. The wolf lunged, not at Kale, but at the men. Fast. Too fast. The second shot fired, but it missed. The wolf was already closing distance. Kale moved. Garrett's voice echoed from the observation room. Kale didn't run, because if he did, it would trigger the hunt instinct completely. Instead, he stepped forward, between them. Stop, he shouted, voice cutting through the tension. For half a second, everything froze. The wolf halted mid-motion, breath heavy, eyes locked on the threat. The men adjusted their aim. And then the door behind them exploded open. Alaric didn't enter like a man. He entered like something that had already lost control. His eyes were glowing gold, but brighter, unstable. His breathing was uneven, his body already reacting to the surge. He didn't speak, didn't warn. He moved straight into the enclosure. Stand down. Callum snapped, shifting his aim, but he was too slow. Alaric hit the ground inside the enclosure, and everything broke. The transformation wasn't gradual, it wasn't controlled. It was violent. Bone shifted, muscle tore and reformed. The sound alone was enough to make the team hesitate. His body dropped, then expanded, fur breaking through skin in seconds. Within moments, there was no human left standing. There were two massive black wolves, one bleeding, one radiating pure, unrestrained alpha dominance. Kale didn't move. He watched, because what mattered wasn't the fight, it was what came after. The two wolves moved together, not as enemies, but as one synchronized force. The disposal team didn't stand a chance. Weapons were knocked aside, rifles crushed, bodies thrown back without hesitation, not killed, but completely neutralized. Callum hit the wall hard enough to lose his grip on the weapon, his breath knocked out. Silence followed. Heavy. Charged. The wolves turned toward each other. For a second, everything stilled. Then the original wolf, the one Kale had worked with, lowered its head. Not in submission, but in alignment. Its form shifted, not physically, but something deeper. It dissolved, not into nothing, but into something that moved like smoke, like shadow. And then it surged forward, straight into the second wolf, into Alaric. The impact was invisible, but the result was immediate. The larger wolf staggered once, its body tensing violently, energy surging through it like a shockwave. Then it stilled. One. Whole. The Alpha King stood alone, now complete. His eyes, Alaric's eyes, locked onto Kale. Kale didn't run, didn't step back. He stood there, breathing steady, even as the most dangerous alpha in that territory stared him down at full strength. The wolf stepped forward, slow, heavy, each step deliberate. Then it stopped, just inches away, close enough that Kale could feel the heat from its body, the raw power in every movement. For a second, nothing happened. Then Kale did the same thing he had done the first day. He raised his hand slowly, palm open. No fear, no resistance. The wolf hesitated for just a fraction of a second. Then it lowered its head and pressed forward into his hand. The contact was different this time, stronger, clearer. No distance, no separation. Kale felt all of it. Not just the beast, but Alaric, whole. And for the first time, there was no conflict in it, no resistance, just one presence, one response. Kale's hand moved, fingers sliding into the fur behind its ear, steady, grounding. That's it, he said quietly. The wolf exhaled and didn't pull away, because now there was nothing left to fight. The room didn't move for several seconds after the fusion. The security team stayed down, weapons scattered, breathing uneven. Garrett stood frozen behind the shattered observation panel, his instincts telling him to act, but his body refusing to interfere. Because what stood in that enclosure now wasn't something you interrupted, it was something you survived. And right in front of it, Kale still had his hand buried in the thick black fur, steady, controlled, like nothing about this moment was abnormal. The massive alpha lowered its head just slightly into his palm, breath heavy, but no longer violent. The energy in the room hadn't disappeared, it had changed. It wasn't unstable anymore, it was focused. Slowly, the wolf stepped back. The shift came without warning. Bone tightened, fur receded. The massive frame collapsed inward, reshaping, reforming. Within seconds, Alaric dropped to one knee on the concrete floor, his breathing rough, his body shaking from the strain of forced reintegration. His shoulders rose and fell sharply, muscles still tense, like they didn't fully trust the calm yet. The silver nitrate graze on his shoulder, carried over from the beast, was still there, bleeding slowly. Kale moved first. No hesitation. He stepped forward, closing the distance, and crouched in front of him. He didn't ask permission. He didn't wait for instructions. He pulled off his outer shirt and pressed it firmly against the wound on Alaric's shoulder, applying pressure to stop the bleeding. His movements were precise, practiced, but his focus wasn't just on the injury. It was on Alaric. "You're stable," Kale said quietly, more a confirmation than a question. Alaric didn't answer immediately. His head was lowered, hair falling forward, breath still uneven, but his hands no longer clenched, no longer shaking. Slowly, they relaxed against the ground. "It's quiet," he said finally, voice rough, unfamiliar even to himself. That alone said everything. Kale nodded slightly. "Because you're not fighting it anymore." Alaric let out a slow breath, eyes lifting just enough to meet Kale's. For the first time since they met, there was no pressure behind his gaze, no dominance pushing outward, just clarity. And something else. Something that hadn't been there before, recognition. Kale didn't look away. Behind them, movement started again. The disposal team struggled back to their feet, disoriented but still trained enough to react. Callum, their leader, wiped blood from his lip, eyes locking onto Alaric immediately. His hand moved toward his sidearm. "Don't," Garrett said sharply from the doorway. Callum didn't listen. He raised the weapon. Alaric didn't even turn. He didn't need to. The shift in the air hit before anything else. Not explosive, not aggressive, just absolute. The kind of pheromone pressure that didn't push, it crushed. It filled the space so completely that resistance didn't exist as an option. Callum froze mid-motion, his hand locking around the weapon but unable to lift it any further. His breath hitched, instinct overriding training in a way no one there could fight. Alaric stood slowly, not rushed, not strained, in control. When he finally turned, his gaze didn't need to be sharp, didn't need to threaten, simply held. And that was enough. You were told to stand down, Alaric said, voice steady now, carrying that same authority as before, but different. Grounded. Callum swallowed hard, his grip loosening slightly without his permission. Alaric took one step forward. The entire room reacted. Every alpha present felt it at once. That instinctive, unavoidable recognition of hierarchy. Not forced, not challenged, acknowledged. You don't enter my territory, Alaric continued, and raise a weapon toward what is mine. The last part landed differently, not louder, but final. Callum's hand dropped completely. Behind him, the rest of the unit followed without needing to be told. Weapons lowered, posture shifted. The fight was over before it could begin again. Leave, Alaric said. This time they listened. No argument, no resistance. They backed out one by one, dragging their injured with them. Tension in the room eased only after the last of them disappeared behind the door. Silence returned, but it wasn't the same silence as before. Garrett exhaled slowly, lowering his weapon as he stepped fully into the room. His gaze moved from Alaric to Cale and back again, processing everything that had just happened. It's done, Garrett said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. Alaric didn't respond, because his focus had already shifted back to Cale. Cale stood there, still close, still steady, hand lowering now that the bleeding had slowed. He didn't step away, he didn't create distance. Alaric noticed that. You stayed, Alaric said. It wasn't a question. Cale tilted his head slightly. Running would have made it worse. Alaric's gaze lingered on him for a second longer than necessary. You didn't know what I was. I knew enough, Cale replied. Another pause. Then, slowly, Alaric stepped closer. This time the movement wasn't instinctive. It was deliberate. He stopped just within reach, close enough that the connection didn't need the beast anymore. It was already there. You felt it, Alaric said quietly. Cale nodded once. Every time. Alaric's jaw tightened slightly. And you still came back. Cale didn't hesitate. Because it wasn't trying to hurt me. That answer settled something. Not fully, but enough. Alaric's hand lifted slightly, hesitating for a fraction of a second before closing the remaining distance. His fingers brushed against Cale's wrist. Not gripping, not claiming, just contact. Real. Immediate. And this time, there was no separation. The connection didn't split between beast and man. It was one. Cale felt it clearly now. Not the overwhelming pressure of an alpha king. Not the instability from before. Just Alaric. You stabilized it, Alaric said. Cale shook his head slightly. No. You let it come back. Alaric's grip tightened just a little. Not enough to restrain, but enough to hold. His eyes didn't leave Cale's. And you, he said quietly, stood in the middle of it. Cale didn't respond, because there was nothing to argue. Alaric exhaled slowly, the last of the tension leaving his body for the first time. His posture wasn't guarded, not defensive, not isolated, open. I spent years trying to control that part of me, Alaric said, locking it away, treating it like something separate. He met Cale's gaze. And now, his fingers shifted slightly against Cale's wrist. Now it listens, not to commands, not to force, to him. And to Cale, that part didn't need to be said out loud. Garrett cleared his throat lightly from behind them, breaking the moment just enough to ground the situation again. The board won't stop, he said. Kane won't either. Alaric didn't look away from Cale. I know, Garrett added. They'll come back. Alaric finally turned slightly, his expression calm. Then they'll learn. Garrett didn't ask what that meant. He already understood. Cale shifted his weight slightly, but didn't step back. And the sanctuary? Alaric looked at him again, direct. Send me everything it needs. Funding, expansion, security. Cale blinked once, surprised but only slightly. You're serious? Alaric's gaze didn't waver. You walked into a cage with something that could have killed you. A brief pause. And you didn't see a monster. Cale didn't answer. Alaric's hand finally released his wrist, but not completely. His fingers brushed lightly once more before pulling back. That's not something I ignore. The meaning was clear. This wasn't just about the beast anymore. It never had been. The connection between them didn't fade when the moment ended. It stayed quiet, steady, real. And as Alaric turned to deal with everything waiting above them, the board, the consequences, the war that would follow, one thing had already changed beyond reversal. He wasn't fighting himself anymore. And for the first time, he had someone he didn't want to push away. Someone he chose not to lose. The Alpha King was no longer alone. And the monster he feared became the one thing that finally brought him peace. 3 weeks after the fusion, Cale Vance stood in the middle of his sanctuary's main rehabilitation yard, watching a feral wolf hybrid approach a feeding station without flinching. The creature had been brought in 6 months ago, malnourished, terrified, marked for euthanasia by a government agency that didn't have the resources to rehabilitate it. Now it took food from his hand with careful, deliberate trust. That was progress. But Cale's mind wasn't fully on the animal in front of him. He kept thinking about the mountain estate. About the wolf that had pressed its massive head into his lap. About the moment Alaric Rutherford had dropped to one knee on the concrete floor, bleeding, shaking, and looked at Cale like he was the only solid thing in a world that had just shattered. Cale shook his head slightly, refocusing. He had work to do. His sanctuary was understaffed, underfunded, and perpetually one crisis away from collapse. He couldn't afford distractions, no matter how magnetic those distractions were. But the distractions arrived anyway, in the form of a secure data transfer that pinged his tablet 3 days later. He opened it to find a wire transfer confirmation. $2.5 million. Deposited into his sanctuary's account, with a note attached in a single line, for the work that matters. AR. Cale stared at the screen for a long moment. Then he read it again. His hands trembled slightly, not from shock, but from the weight of what this meant. He could expand. He could hire more staff. He could build the proper enclosures, upgrade the medical equipment, take in the animals that had been turned away for lack of space. Everything he had dreamed of, everything he had fought for, suddenly possible. He didn't call Alaric. He didn't know how to begin that conversation. Instead, he sent a single reply. Thank you. I won't waste it. The response came an hour later. I know. Over the next 6 weeks, the sanctuary transformed. Cale hired 2 additional veterinarians, 3 rehabilitation specialists, and a full-time security team. He expanded the enclosures, installed state-of-the-art climate control, and began a partnership with a genetics lab to study the unique pheromone profiles of rescued hybrids. The work consumed him. Long hours, endless paperwork, constant problem-solving. But every night, when he finally collapsed into bed, his mind drifted back to the mountain. He didn't expect Alaric to visit. The Alpha King arrived without warning on a cold afternoon in late autumn. Cale was in the main enclosure yard, working with a wounded wolf dog that had been abandoned by its pack, when Garrett's voice crackled over the intercom. Cale, you have a visitor. Don't panic. Cale looked up, and his heart stopped. Alaric Rutherford stood at the gate, dressed in a simple dark coat. No entourage, no security detail, just him. He looked different from the estate, less guarded, more grounded, though the same quiet authority radiated from him like heat from a furnace. Cale handed the feeding bucket to his assistant and walked over, wiping his hands on his trousers. "You're a long way from your territory," Kale said, keeping his voice neutral, though his pulse had already quickened. Alaric's gaze swept over the sanctuary, the enclosures, the staff, the animals, with the kind of focused attention that missed nothing. "I wanted to see it," he said simply. "What you built. What I invested in." Kale gestured toward the main building. "I can give you a tour. But I warn you, it's not as polished as your estate." "I don't need polished." Alaric fell into step beside him, and Kale felt the familiar shift in the air, the way Alaric's presence seemed to recalibrate the space around him. Not overwhelming, but undeniable. The tour took an hour. Kale showed him the rehabilitation enclosures, the medical wing, the observation rooms, the kitchens. He introduced Alaric to the senior staff, who all reacted with the same stunned, barely concealed awe. Alaric was polite but brief, his attention never straying far from Kale. When they reached the final enclosure, a large, open area where a pack of rescued hybrids had been reintroduced to social living, Alaric stopped. He stood at the fence, watching the animals move through the tall grass with a fluid, instinctive grace. "This is what you saved," Alaric said quietly. "Not just their lives, their ability to live with others." Kale joined him at the fence. "That's the goal. They weren't meant to be isolated. They just needed the right conditions to learn trust again." He paused. "It's the same for people." Alaric turned to look at him. The amber eyes, once cold and guarded, now held something softer, something Kale hadn't seen before. "You're talking about me." "I'm talking about anyone who's been forced to separate parts of themselves," Kale said evenly. "The isolation creates the instability. The connection heals it." Alaric was silent for a moment. Then he reached out, slowly, deliberately, and took Kale's hand. His grip was warm, steady, grounding. "You healed it," Alaric said. "You. Not the work. Not the protocol. You." Kale looked down at their joined hands, then back up at Alaric's face. "I didn't do it alone. You chose to let it happen. That was the hardest part." Alaric's jaw tightened slightly. "I spent years telling myself I had to be separate, that the part of me that couldn't be controlled, the part that was wild, had to be locked away. I believed it so completely that I made it real. I pulled it out of myself and trapped it in a cage." He exhaled slowly. "And then you knelt down in that cage and showed me it wasn't a monster. It was just waiting." Kale's hand tightened around his. "It's still part of you. It always was." Alaric stepped closer, close enough that Kale could feel the warmth of his body, the faint trace of his pheromones shifting into something open, inviting. "I don't want to be separate anymore," Alaric said, his voice low. "I don't want to lock it away. But I don't know how to exist with it, not alone." Kale understood. "You're not alone now." The words hung between them, simple and absolute. Alaric's free hand came up, fingers brushing lightly against Kale's jaw, tilting his face up. His eyes searched Kale's, looking for hesitation, for doubt. He found none. "Tell me to stop," Alaric said quietly. "And I will." Kale didn't say anything. He leaned into the touch, closing the last distance between them. Their lips met, gentle, tentative, tasting of cold air and something deeper. It was not the frantic, desperate contact of the fusion. It was a choice. A beginning. When they broke apart, Alaric's forehead rested against Kale's, his breath warm against Kale's skin. "I don't know what this looks like," he admitted. "I don't know how to fit you into a world I spent years trying to control." Kale smiled just slightly. "We don't have to figure it all out today. We just have to keep choosing each other." Alaric pulled back, meeting his gaze. "Then I choose you, Kale Vance. Every day, every version of me." Kale's heart swelled with something he hadn't felt in years. Not just hope, but certainty. He squeezed Alaric's hand. "Then let's start by getting you a proper meal. My staff has been whispering about you since you arrived. If I don't feed you, they'll riot." Alaric's lips curved into a rare, genuine smile. "I'd like that." That evening, they sat together in Kale's small office, eating takeout from the local diner while the sanctuary settled into its nightly rhythm. The conversation was easy, natural. Alaric asked about the animals, Kale asked about the restructuring of the board, and they found a rhythm that felt neither forced nor fragile. When the night grew late, Alaric stood to leave. The estate is a long drive, Kale said. You can stay in the guest cabin if you want. It's small, but it's warm. Alaric hesitated, not from reluctance, but from something deeper. If I stay, I won't want to leave. Kale met his gaze. Then don't. The cabin was indeed small, a single room with a bed, a wood stove, and a window that looked out over the forest. They stood in the center, the silence between them charged with everything that had been said and everything that still needed to be spoken. Alaric reached out, his hand finding Kale's again. I've been alone for so long, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I forgot what it felt like to not be. Kale stepped closer, their bodies aligned, no distance between them. You're not alone anymore, Alaric. I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere. Alaric's arms wrapped around him, pulling him into a fierce, grounding embrace. Kale felt the tension leave Alaric's body, the years of control, the weight of the beast, the isolation, all of it dissolving in the warmth of contact. He pressed his face into Alaric's chest, listening to the steady, powerful rhythm of his heart. This was the healing, not a single moment, but the accumulation of trust, day by day, touch by touch. The beast wasn't gone. It was part of Alaric now, integrated, whole. And Kale had been the one to show him it wasn't a monster to be feared. It was a part of himself that had been waiting for acceptance. The night stretched on, quiet and full of possibility. And when dawn broke over the sanctuary, Alaric was still there, his arm wrapped securely around Kale, his breathing slow and peaceful. They had found their way back to each other, not through force, not through fate, but through the quiet, steady power of one Omega who had seen a beast and chosen trust instead of fear. And in that choice, he had healed not just the Alpha King, but the kingdom that had been waiting for him to come home. The Alpha King was no longer alone, and the monster he feared had become the anchor that finally brought him peace.